say first thank you so much for coming. It's a beautiful day out there, and it was a temptation even for me as I walked across the park to just pretend I, lost my way. So I really appreciate seeing all of you. And what I know it's always better to, or the audience always thinks it's better for someone, and it usually is, or it can be, for someone to talk their talk rather than read it, but I tend to digress. Well, some of you know me, so I don't even need to explain why I really need to read my paper today. And so let me just read it. I'll try to be lively and make eye contact and all of that good stuff to keep you awake. My main terror is that I will be too long, although I have timed myself a couple of times. It should be 45 minutes. So let's get started so I can be true to my promise. So I'll just begin by telling you that what I will be talking about with you this evening is really a kind of a rumination, a sort of think piece that I hope won't turn out to be like that 1999 movie, Being John Malkovich, where somehow the whole thing, while not a fantasy exactly, takes place inside John Malkovich's head. I spend a lot of time inside my own head, so I will try hard not to make this talk an arcane puzzle or too pedantic, two things I actually really like. So the initial ideas here, oh, and this, by the way, this comes from a much larger, longer rumination. So I'm also hoping that doesn't sound too disjointed or truncated as I desperately try to get down a very long piece into a 45-minute time frame. The initial ideas here emerged a number of years ago while I was teaching a couple of graduate seminars, Comparative Diasporas and Racing Diasporas. I was struck by what seemed to be a consistent contradiction in the study of diaspora. On the one hand, there is an emphasis on understanding diasporas in terms of hybridity, décalage, cross-cutting dialogues, intra- and inter-diasporic antagonisms and empathies, or ephemeral, incomplete, unfinished aesthetics. And of course, you'll hear me channeling Stuart Hall, Brent Edwards, Randy Mattori, Jackie Brown, and Dana Rush, among many others. Each of these terms belongs to them in that order. Yet on the other hand, there is the continuing propensity in diaspora studies I saw to encapsulate Atlantic world diasporas into ethno-racially defined groups, notably African and Indian or Asian. It's still not uncommon in the current moment to find publications, conferences, and research projects occupying comfortable enclaves, I've contributed to some of these myself, that are demarcated by abiding implicit assumptions about affinities, cultural affinities to be exact, which imply racial essences that group together diasporic streams into not only distinguishable but selectively aggregated entities. There are, of course, some nuances to this, which I will discuss momentarily. So this evening, let's take a brief look at this contradiction in diaspora studies and this contradiction's linchpins. What I'm suggesting are the concepts of culture and identity. In diaspora studies in general, diasporas have been most valued for the stories they tell about cultural encounters, transformations, the vitality of cultural production, and the conditions of self-reflexivity that give rise to new or emerging identities. In the study of Atlantic world diasporas, culture and identity arguably have been both building blocks and end goal, assumed to be de facto integral to and imperative for diaspora studies. Although these concepts are certainly important aspects of Atlantic world and other diasporas, to rely on them as diasporas necessarily most important or sole conceptual elements reinforces this key contradiction that such a reliance produces. The consequence, in turn, is an undermining of the best revisionist intentions of diaspora theory. That is, this commitment to hybridity, décalage, cross-cutting dialogues, etc. Now, I'm not arguing that we should jettison the concepts of culture and identity. I'm an anthropologist after all. The primary advantage of the culture concept, particularly in anthropology, is that it takes notions of difference that distinguish self and other out of the domain of the natural and the innate. In diaspora studies, culture as a concept tends to be concretized into itemized and separable features, which are then interpreted to identify and represent particular diasporas. So for example, in theorizing diaspora, Randy Mattori argues that, quote, the cultures of the Afro-Atlantic are not internally systematic, circumscribed, or scattered or fading remains of Africa, but instead are refashioned through a voluntary exchange of people, objects, and ideas, end quote, such as, he goes on to say, music, religion, motor habits, and language. Mattori suggests that we approach the concept of diaspora metaphorically as a cross-cutting dialogue, as he puts it, among the cultural reproductions of dispersed ethnic groups, neighboring groups, and groups surrounding ocean perimeters. Envisaging the Afro-Atlantic as a transnational cultural field, quote, long engaged in a mighty dialogue with the Middle East and the Indian Ocean, end quote, Afro-Atlantic interlocutors embrace and transform, Mattori argues, what they encounter for their own purposes. Thus he offers, quote, Cuban santeros employ Chinese porcelain vessels and syncretize the orishas with various avatars of the Buddha and the Chinese fertility goddess Kuan Yin, end quote. Mattori productively concludes that, quote, there is no natural reason to isolate the Black Atlantic from the Atlantic world as a whole, any more than there is a reason to isolate the Atlantic perimeter from the Mediterranean, Indian Ocean, and Far Eastern regions with which it has long interacted, end quote. But in order to make his case, he illustrates the metaphor with itemized cultural features that hark back to national, ethnic, or racial content. Or, as another example, as Patricia Mohammed observes, Chinese populations in the Caribbean share a similar ideological heritage with Indo-Caribbeans in terms of, quote, a script and an aesthetic, end quote, that are recognizably Indian or Chinese. And she cites V.S. Naipaul's famous The Baker Story, his famous short story, as signaling examples of Caribbean Chinese communities, Chinese newspapers, and the ubiquitous calendars replete with women and flowers and waterfalls. Familiar throughout the Americas, these fractional aspects of Chinese diasporic life worlds serve as piecemeal ethno-racial demarcations, or cultural stereotypes, that represent a particular Asian diaspora. The questions that I'm still wondering about myself are how or if we can explore diaspora as dialogue, for example, as Mattori calls for, I think quite productively, without referencing individuated items like vessels, avatars, and deities. Are there specificities that name a diaspora which do not necessarily lead back or even when against intention to cultural origin points? And are there cultural features which do not necessarily denote identity in ethno-racial, national, or originary terms? This itemization of culture also gives substance or materiality to identity, which is another abstraction. That is, identities in diaspora are often made empirical, that is, concretized, as forms of consciousness or self-awareness that are in part exemplified by certain cultural markers. It is this very use of the culture concept and identity in its toe which keeps intact the boundaries that divide diasporas into distinct ethno-racial units and flies in the face of the current scholarly purchase emphasizing hybridity, décalage, dialogue, the unfinished, and the intra-inter conflict. While I don't have specific answers to all this, spoiler alert, I think a closer look at the work that these concepts does will offer a clearer picture of the ways they may inadvertently reproduce race-inflected premises contrary to the scholarly mission of diaspora studies, at least today. Where I'm going to end up, and I hope you'll follow me there, is a question about the nature of bodies. That is there something about the corporeal human body that necessarily must catalog cultural identifiers that, in diaspora, signal racialized distinctions? I want to approach this by way of what I call the flight of spirits, supernatural worlds that accompany human diasporas. I won't be suggesting that spirit worlds are not quote-unquote cultural or part of humans' cultural repertoire, but by contrast to their mortal companions, they seem to lend themselves well to diaspora studies' paradigm of hybridity, disjuncture, and dialogue, yet without reiterating a racializing discourse. Spirits are embodied in certain ways. Human beings are also embodied as conduits or orchestrators of spirits and their work. I'm thinking about the significance that different forms of embodiment make when culture, the concepts of culture and identity, are associated with human diasporas and with spirit diasporas. Is there a difference between the culture and identity of humans and the culture and identity of spirits? And what then might the significance be for diaspora studies' commitment to its own revisionist agendas? Among the most important scholars of diaspora in this revisionist period is Stuart Hall. Hall's analytical and political project was to understand that the Afro-Atlantic experience, to understand the Afro-Atlantic experience through difference. That's his word. That is, the diversity of diasporic Black experience. In his critique of the discriminatory and reductive racism that immigrants of color from the British Empire suffered in the colonial metropole, the problem of identity became central to Hall's scholarship and activism. Pitted against the idea of cultural, racial, or other essences as the ingredient of identity, Hall's notion of diaspora signals diversity and a conception of identity that acknowledges the ruptures and discontinuities, his term, that make cultural identity, quote, a matter of becoming as well as of being, end quote. Thus, as Hall sees it, for example, in his seminal 1990 essay, Cultural Identity and Diaspora, diasporas are articulated, his term, connected and voiced through their differences as well as their similarities. His key point is that identity, quote, is not as transparent or unproblematic as we think, end quote. Rather than thinking of identity, quote, as an already accomplished fact, we should think of it always in process. And this is a view which challenges, as he says, the very authority and authenticity to which the term cultural identity lays claim. Yet Hall also sees a Caribbean, quote, uniqueness, end quote, that stems from its diasporic, quote, ruptures and discontinuities, end quote. Black Caribbean identities, he contends, must be thought of in terms of the, quote, dialogic relationship, end quote, between the two axes of similarity, continuity, and difference, rupture. The latter being a reminder of the shared experience of the Africa-derived ruptures of slavery, transportation, colonization, and migration. Arguably, identity for Hall is the most important component of diaspora. It rejects the idea of, as he puts it, one shared culture, a sort of collective one true self. At the same time, however, in Hall's thinking, there is something, quote, essentially, end quote, Caribbean. That is a, quote, diaspora aesthetic, end quote, outlined as the region's, quote, mixes of color, pigmentation, physiognomic type, cuisine, and crossovers of cut and mix, and an underlying ubiquitous presence Africaine in the daily life of the enslaved, their languages, oral traditions, religious beliefs and practices, bodily movements, and the arts, crafts, and music of slave and post-emancipation society. which for Hall constitute the hidden presence of Africa in Caribbean culture. On the other hand, Hall acknowledges the importance of cultural identity for post-colonial struggle, including negritude and Pan-Africanism, but he sees it, quote, he argues that it, quote, imposed an imaginary coherence on the experience of dispersal and fragmentation, end quote, that is the history of all diasporas, quote, by representing Africa as lying at the center of our cultural identity, a connection that heals the loss of identity that has been integral to the Caribbean experience. Thus, the presence Africaine, for example, is history, not essence, for Hall. In this way, diaspora is a metaphor for Hall, not a literal dispersion of, for example, what he calls, quote, scattered tribes. It is instead a symbol of difference, a symbol of hybridity. So we can see that the target of Hall's critique is culture with a capital C, the bounded, essentialized, inert, false and facile panacea for injury and powerful colonial tool of Western epistemology. But he's not quite reconciled in his intellectual struggle with culture as essence and culture as history. So he's going a little bit back and forth with that. Identity, however, is a concept which Hall holds close. As he put it almost 2 decades later in 2008, those who, quote, those who are obliged to uproot themselves from home, place, and family, from culturally variegated new settlements whose ways of life and forms of consciousness are diasporic, and whose diasporic dilemma is a question of identity, how is the sense of self understood when one's lived reality is movement among places, histories, cultures, religions, end quote. For Hall, hybridity's counter-hegemonic political possibilities are embodied in and expressed as identity or identities. But despite or due to serving his particular purposes, his retention and recuperation of the concept of identity still relies on cataloged indicators of embodied Africa-specific cultural features, from physiognomic type to cuisine to bodily movement. Culture and identity also find their place in diaspora through the experience of trauma, a theme that is rarely far from diaspora studies, whether as rupture and dislocation in the past or the present-day experience of social inequality and its resistance. Perhaps because trauma is significantly understood in psychological affective terms, its relationship to diaspora seems to be logically tied to identity. Trauma contributes to what shapes who we are, how we see ourselves. In diaspora studies, when identity is damaged by trauma, it is often quote-unquote culture that analysts bring to the rescue. Various itemized features are deduced to be proof of the fortitude and tenacity of a group, its sustainability in the face of dispersal and discrimination. Stuart Hall emphasizes the importance of cultural identity expressed as an intact inner sense of self, a form of healing agency that can resist Western hegemony's imposed notion of cultural identity as a fixed essence. Drawing from Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth, Hall argues that, quote, in an interior process, the other begins to see himself, herself, as other, and this inner expropriation of cultural identity cripples and deforms, end quote. In other words, if the other internalizes the Western colonial categories that identify him or her, it will result in a deformation of personhood. As Fanon himself argued about, quote, the sphere of psycho-affective equilibrium, end quote, the colonized, particularly who he calls native intellectuals, who are torn between two worlds, colonizer and colonized, make efforts to rehabilitate themselves and, quote, escape from the claws of colonialism, end quote, despite that liberating consciousness is a wrenching business. Although necessary, quote, tearing away from the familiarity of, albeit destructive, colonial culture is, quote, painful and difficult. If not undertaken, however, Fanon says, quote, there will be serious psychoaffective injuries, and the result will be individuals without an anchor, without a horizon, colorless, stateless, rootless, a race of angels, as Fanon lyrically puts it, those who have damaged or effaced identities. Fanon pointedly observed that, quote, men of African cultures who are still fighting in the name of African Negro culture and who have called many congresses in the name of unity of that culture should today realize that all their efforts amount to is to make comparisons between coins and sarcophagi, end quote. Indeed, quote, the Negroes of Chicago only resemble the Nigerians or the Tanganyikans insofar as they were all defined in relation to the whites, end quote. That is, through a hegemonic Euro-colonial gaze. And Fanon continues, the problems of Richard Wright and Langston Hughes differ fundamentally from those of Leopold Senghor and Jomo Kenyatta. The productive sources of identification that Fanon pinpoints are cultural only insofar as they reflect what he calls a national culture. That is, a culture that's engaged with events of today, as he puts it, quote, a national culture is the whole body of efforts made by a people in the sphere of thought to describe, justify, and praise the action through which that people has created itself and keeps itself in existence, end quote. It is, quote, around the people's struggles that African Negro culture takes on substance, and not around songs, poems, or folklore, end quote. For Fanon, national culture carries a different sense of culture, one that emphasizes a certain kind of concerted consciousness about rights and justice. His concern with identity reflects his psychiatric work on the psychopathology of colonization. Identity for Fanon is a process, as it is for Hall, but for Fanon, its importance is as a form of consciousness where struggle keeps one's self whole, not torn, rather than, as it is for Hall, something located in culture as cultural identity. So all I'm saying is that Hall took a few liberties with Fanon, in a nutshell. In his influential work on the Black Atlantic, Paul Gilroy argued that although Black African and white European, Black/African, white/European, have been constituted as opposites, in reality they have long been interpolated. Part of Gilroy's project was to critique what he sees as ethnic absolutism, or the over-integrated conceptions of culture which present immutable ethnic differences as an absolute break in the histories and experiences of Black and white people. And he's also critiquing what he calls cultural insiderism, or rhetorical strategies that convey an absolute sense of ethnic difference, both of which, he says, distinguish people from each other and affirm forms of cultural kinship. The challenge is to find challenge, according to Gilroy, is to find satisfactory ways of naming the processes of cultural mutation and restless discontinuity that exceed racial discourse and avoid capture by its agents. In this same vein, I would argue that Afro and Indo, or Asian, also comprise mutations and restless discontinuities that exceed racial discourse. So despite the indispensable work of all of these scholars, why have Afro-Indo or Afro-Asian aspects of social formation in the Caribbean and arguably the Atlantic largely been cordoned off into their own scholarly domains? These are never easy questions, even in light of important interventions such as Hall's about cultural identity and diaspora. For example, in that very essay, he includes, as an aside, a parenthetical quip, really, where he states that when African slavery ended, quote, it was temporarily refreshed by indentured labor from the Asian subcontinent. This neglected fact explains why, when you visit Guyana or Trinidad, you see symbolically inscribed in the faces of their peoples the paradoxical truth of Christopher Columbus's mistake. You can find Asia by sailing west if you know where to look, exclamation mark, end quote. More nuanced about the role of Africa in Atlantic diaspora studies, Hall finds Asia as easy to locate as phenotype. Now, let's move toward the Asians, who are having their own conversations. Right? Jacqueline Nassy Brown, bear with me, Jacqueline Nassy Brown offers an important critique of, as she puts it, quote, the obsession with the authenticity question in Black diaspora studies. What she means is a preoccupation implying that, as she puts it, Blacks worldwide grapple mostly with matters of roots, traditions, and origins, end quote. She's taking issue with that, as you know, in her very brilliant book, Dropping Anchor, Setting Sail. Now, Brown contrasts this fixation, as she calls it, with what she sees as the, quote, much fuller array of concerns covered in Black diaspora studies' Asian American counterpart. Okay, so she's praising Asian American diaspora studies as not falling into this authenticity trap. Brown's suggestion, however, raises a productive question about how much fuller the array of concerns in Caribbean Asian, that is, Indian and Chinese diaspora studies might actually be. Although research on Chinese in the Circum-Caribbean has been growing for some time, a large body of research historically has been devoted to Indians, or South Asians now you have to call them, in the region, which has had a preoccupation with cultural traditions. Indo-Caribbean diaspora studies, or diaspora research, developed largely out of scholarly interest in the relationship between cultural authenticity and the diffusion of Indian culture. Rather than establishing an Indo-America culture area, so to speak, the research has arguably been as much or more concerned with India, as India abroad, than with New World landscapes. This perspective is likely a key reason why most of the literature on Indo-Caribbeans, whether scholarly, news media, or popular wisdom, from the eve of their arrival in the contemporary period, has tended to, from the eve of their arrival to the contemporary period, has tended to characterize them as cultural as opposed to other kinds of agents, who have retained inexorably their ancestral traditions and traits. In the British West Indies, for example, it is the case that Indian indentured laborers were concentrated demographically on sugar estates, making palpable the idea of group homogeneity. But certain powerful set-pieced Orientalist images of Indian, quote-unquote, or Hindu, H-I-N-D-O-O, culture, emphasizing their exotic clothing, penchant for jewelry, noteworthy, quote, Caucasian features paired with, quote, dark skin, and mysterious or horrifying pagan customs were a crucial dimension of the British colonial gaze, which congealed names, that is representations, into things, that is subjects. And I had to take out, there's this fabulous quotation, and if you're interested, I can send it, the page, from W.E.B. Du Bois's novel, Dark Princess, where, you know, it's a very important novel in Pan-Asian and Pan-African revolutionary studies, but it's really, it's a product of its time in terms of its really purple prose of Orientalist imagery, of how he describes Princess Kautilya, who's the Matthew, the African-American protagonist's love interest. And it's fabulous, but I couldn't make it in the time frame, but I can send it to you. It's really quite amazing. It underscores my point, exceeds my point. Now, it must be said that in response to perceptions of marginalization through disfranchised, uneven absorption into dominant Euro-colonial and later Afro-independent societies, Indo-Caribbean diaspora communities have sought their own quote-unquote authentic ancestral cultural forms. They're invested in this too, as they have made energetic use of the cultural identity-based platforms of political enfranchisement that multicultural nationalism offers its ethno-racial constituencies. Afro-Caribbean diasporas have done the same sorts of boundary-producing work in their own anti-colonial struggles for sovereignty and post-independence claims for equal representation. Together, these respective discursive practices amount to a resort to mutually exclusive culture as what substantiates and binds identity. Asian diaspora studies that are concerned with East Asian populations, including Chinese, Korean, Japanese, Filipino, are for the most part theoretically committed to recognizing the plural character of these diasporas. As Russell Perenius and Lok Sue contend, theorizing, quote, a pan-ethnic Asian diaspora, end quote, is to be avoided, because doing so would, quote, deny the multiplicity of experience of the multiple and varied formations of Asian diasporas and reinforce the exoticized Oriental other of Western fantasy, end quote. It's interesting to contrast the positionalities of these two diasporic streams here. The sheer range of histories, practices, and experiences cannot be contained under the singular collective category of Asian diasporas, these number of these scholars claim. Each state, for example, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, the Philippines, has its own historical narrative and culturally specific discourses and practices that inform sentiments of belonging. Hence, Ian Ang's contention that the concept diaspora should only be approached as a heuristic device, quote, a strategy essentializing and a strategically essentializing, she's now, channeling Gayatri Spivak, a strategically essentializing and homogenizing move that focuses our analytic eye, right? End quote. With this conundrum of intra-diasporic diversity in mind, David Palumbo Liu pushes the argument further, and I think very productively, asking, quote, why retain Asia? What holds these discrepant phenomena together? Why restrict them to Asia, end quote. He goes on to suggest that Asian, the term, functions as a racial term, one that relies on some kind of, quote, family resemblance, channeling Wittgenstein, among subjects under study, and which ultimately erases one of the paramount effects of diaspora, as Palumbo Liu and others have noted, mixedness, right? Again, another way of saying hybridity, cross-cultural dialogue, etc. So, like the role of Africa and African heritage in New World diasporas, Asia and its heritages can reiterate race, Asia with quotation marks, and its heritages can reiterate race, homogeneity, and national identity. Ian Ang concludes that despite the usefulness of, quote, Asian diasporas, end quote, as analytical frames, there are no Asians or Asian diasporas. There are only perceptions of people or of diasporas as, quote unquote, Asian. The question is how to identify and trace those diasporas, though, and also whether material artifacts and their symbolizations about Asians, Africans, or anyone else can ever be neutral or non-racializing when their attribution to certain groups derives from historically situated unequal relations of power. Discursive traditions may perpetuate the very racialized other that they argue against. Now, I've argued so far that despite the emphasis on hybridity and fluidity, etc., in diaspora studies, their connection to the culture concept in general and to a partition of features approach to group identities in particular has tended to reproduce essentializing race premise divisions that can obscure what is shared among diasporic peoples despite objectives to the contrary. It is useful to consider moments or cases where diaspora has been productively explored by other means. In consideration of time, I can only mention a few examples, and you may be very familiar with some of these. Afro-Asian encounters, edited by Heike Rafael Hernandez and Shannon Steen, Vijay Prasad's Everybody Was Kung Fu Fighting, Bill Mullen's Afro-Orientalism, and Fred Ho and Bill Mullen's Afro-Asia. And the only thing I want to say about these for now is that in this scholarship, the concept of diaspora does not take the lead as a theoretical framework, but rather whose principal significance is as a condition of possibility, where the moving targets of lived experience challenge racial pigeonholing that concepts of culture and identity can reinforce. In the encounters and shared imaginaries discussed in this literature, diaspora is a necessary form of mobility and catalyst for change, but is itself not the conceptual target of analysis. For example, in her work on Atlantic, her fabulous work, I love this woman, work on Atlantic world borderlands and frontiers, Lara Putnam observes that from the 1880s to the 1930s, formerly indentured Indian laborers spread throughout Central America, yet these diasporas remain a, quote, open question, as she puts it, in the historiography, partly because of the challenge of identifying them in the extant sources. The borderlands of Central America were regions where identity boundaries were blurred and varied depending on location. For example, in Limon, Costa Rica, Indo-Caribbean coolies, C-U-L-I-S, were absorbed into the population identified as negros jamaiquinos, or Jamaican blacks. But in Panama, they formed distinct communities known locally as babus. As Putnam's discussion implies, when culture and its component parts are not the basic organizing principle, identity is not self-evident, and diasporas, lived experience as opposed to concept, are harder to pin down. In Fanon's thinking as well, culture, race, and identity are not confined by embodiment because they are abstractions. They are forms of consciousness expressed as the agency of the colonized directed toward rights and justice. Fanon does not objectify culture, race, and identity as, for example, if you'll remember, coins and sarcophagi, which he observes are criteria imposed by colonial relations of power. Nor are culture, race, and identity to be represented, he contends, as songs, poems, and folklore, if you remember, which Fanon seems to be suggesting are epiphenomenal, causing us to misrecognize the bases of cultural unity. But in much of diaspora studies, intended or not, itemized and corporeal materials reinforce the creation of enclaves by means of culturalist, racializing, and essentializing borderlines. Is it advisable then to let go of diaspora as an end goal of analysis and instead treat it as a condition of possibility, a means to an end that is open and contingent rather than predictive, proving a point? In diaspora studies, corporeality and embodiment are the conveyors of culture, identity, and race. So considering diasporas in ways other than exemplified by bodies, objects, people, what I'll call source lands or origination areas, is also worth considering. What might diaspora look like disembodied? And how might this help correct diaspora studies' lingering contradiction, just to refresh you once again, an endorsement of fluid hybridity and reinforcement of condensed or circumscribed enclaves. In the Atlantic world, the study, now we're going to make a little shift here. Hope I'm connecting the dots. In the Atlantic world, the study of ethereal agents, as I've called them, is normally part of a larger interest in religious traditions, typically parsed as Afro-Atlantic religions like Vodou, or as South Asian-derived forces like Mariaman, or the broadly all-inclusive mediated supernatural powers called Ovia, which is still typically approached as an Afro-Atlantic tradition, by the way. These religious traditions and the ethereal agents that belong to them represent the epitome of creolization, ambiguous borders, and fluid development and transformation. Yet, as always, there are complications to representation. As Joseph Murphy points out about New World, quote, black religions, end quote, they are not all alike. Yet emphasizing the similarities among, quote, diasporan religions, as he calls them, is appropriate, Murphy contends, because generalizations can be useful in revealing global connections. From a hemispheric perspective, he says, the religions of the African diaspora are, quote, a family of traditions, cousins sharing common ancestors and set apart by the intermarriages made in the line. They remain many traditions, yet reveal one tradition, end quote. But this notion of family could be subjected to Palumbo New's critique of the racial implications of the family resemblance idea in Asian diaspora studies. The flights of spirits or the deities and other ethereal agents who are part of the life worlds of their human companions throughout the Atlantic world comprise beings hailing from or associated with Africa, Asia, Europe, and the Middle East, and might be approached as constituting diasporas in their own right. This is not because they exist independently of the human imagination, a condition that depends on a given individual's point of view, but rather because they possess, as humans report, their own motive force, mobility and intentions, an agency that is independent of human involvement and often humans' wishes, if not, as some perspectives have it, independent of the human imagination. Although I will touch this evening on what I consider a particularly good example of a diasporic ethereal agent, Mami Wada, who is going to make her appearance momentarily, a water spirit whose provenance is multi-layered and complex, my point here is not to detail individual spirits' biographies or specific religious traditions. For one thing, studies of diasporan religions and their spirituality, or way of making the spirit present among the people, as Murphy calls it, are vast. Also, ethereal agents' mobility per se does not, by and large, receive focused scholarly attention. My aim here is to highlight the overall potential that diasporic ethereal agents offer diaspora studies, and to illustrate that the immateriality of spirits can broaden our focus on the corporeal and the embodied. My suggestion is that analysts treat the human transporters of spirits in flight perhaps more like we treat those spirits themselves, as fluid and hybrid, where, as Dana Resch observes, completion is not the point. As they are characterized in scholarship, disembodied beings and their travels seem to be less compressed into racial signifiers than their embodied bearers are by the expectations of the concepts of culture and identity, which lie at the center of diaspora. Disembodiment seems to encourage visions of being unbound, hybrid, dialogic, and disjunctive, from Dana Resch's Vodun land, a state of mind anywhere that Vodou exists, and whose vast domain consists of the spirit world and its access, where verificationist epistemology has no place, to the whoosh of Richard Price's Saramaka colleague toys, crossing between the worlds of the dead and the living, between the invisible and the visible, and between communities under the sea as well as on land. The flight of spirits and those like Toy who can commune with them are characterized by diasporic ambiguity and fluidity. Although Atlantic diaspora studies focuses a good deal on religious traditions, this worldly and otherworldly, embodied and disembodied subjects do not generally receive the same treatment. One reason may be scholars' handling of history. As Vodun land and Toy's suspension of the laws of time and space travel imply, historical starting points are nebulous, non-existent, or irrelevant in these contexts. But with humans' diasporas, culture and identity locate them in place, even if that place is imagined, long left, or composite. Afro-Caribbean or Afro-Atlantic diasporas and Indo-Caribbean or Asian Atlantic diasporas, for example, are typically linked to slavery and indenture, respectively, which involve, among other things, source lands, locations that are culturally defined, identity-conferring, and exclusivity-inducing in racialized terms. Slavery and indenture can act as facilitators that lock in quote-unquote difference, and their diasporic streams are traced through cultural icons variously emphasized by analysts. However, as mobile ethereal agents or spirits are experienced and theorized, they seem to defy location in this sense, and thus defy the confines of history, while not being without histories. Mamiwata, okay, we're gonna, Mamiwata, thank you, a spirit so named in the lingua franca pidgin English of West Africa, and again, this is only one image. There's many, 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 many images, and you'll see why in a minute, because she's sort of everything and everything. Mamiwata, a spirit so named in the lingua franca pidgin English of West Africa, represents a complex of practices and beliefs involving water deities. Some scholars view Mamiwata as having arisen in the 19th century, reflecting chromolithographs of a snake charmer in a German circus that were reprinted in great number in both India and England and widely distributed throughout sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia by colonial and local trade networks. Chromolithographs have been a crucial aspect, in fact, of the spread of African-derived religious traditions throughout the Americas. Mamiwata is also found in the Caribbean and in the US. Although usually gendered as she, Mamiwata is characterized by her transness, as Henry Drull puts it, transgendered, transcultural, transhistorical. Like water itself, Drull observes, Mamiwata is omnipresent and mutable. Materialized in chromolithic print form, she is a palimpsest of her travels and the locals who venerate her, whether in the form of a mermaid accompanied by a snake, associated with sexual seduction, good fortune, fertility, or danger. Frequently embodied as half fish, half human, she conveys in-betweenness and ambiguity, moving between the world of the living and the world of the spirits. Mamiwata, shares some qualities with other water spirits. Others are hers alone, linked with specific localities. Thus she is best approached as numerous spiritual forces whose description differs depending on location and devotees. Among Afro-Surinamese and Amerindian peoples, for example, Watramama is, quote, more or less a generic name for a whole subspectrum of water deities, end quote. Sorry I took out the footnote, don't remember who said that, but it's not me. No plagiarism here. This, I can tell you later if you're interested. This spirit's images and traditions are filtered through many cultural lenses, rendering her quintessentially transcultural, a free, unencumbered spirit of nature detached from any social bonds. Fluidity and contingency still produce intellectual challenges for scholars. In her analysis of Mamiwata, Eileen Moyer emphasizes that particular narrative genres are most definitively characterized within, quote, the realm of academic imagination, end quote, although being no less varied than other storytellers, audiences, times, and places. Charles Gore and Joseph Nevedomsky described Mamiwata's, quote, extensive, contingent, and fragmented practices as resisting being, quote, reduced to the analytical sanctions of unanimity, end quote, a practice some scholars nonetheless attempt. Elsewhere, Nevedomsky argues that the pidgin term mamiwata is a linguistic condensation by local devotees for the benefit of outsiders, charging that scholars' universalizing of mamiwata has produced, quote, a hemispheric attraction, a global contestant for the Miss World of Religious Icons title, end quote. Excuse me. Clearly, the degree and meaning of this resistance to reduction is a matter of debate. A point to recall at this juncture is that while Palumbo Liu would likely be in sympathy with anti-universalism, given his critique of Asian, the concept of Asian in Asian diaspora, by contrast is Murphy's emphasis on families of cousins sharing common denominators that established the Afro in Afro-Americas. Whereas Asian represents for Palumbo Liu the objectionable contours of race, diasporan religions underscores for Murphy a beneficial emphasis on globalism. Dealing with a mobile ethereal agent rather than human diasporas, Nevedomsky chooses the specific local over the general global. But we have not reached an analytical impasse. The point is not to find a final solution, to prove something. The work of these scholarly debates keeps animated the question about how to best handle the malleability of spirits, maintaining an assumption of plasticity, transness, and immunity to and inadvisability of enclaveization. Unlike the diasporic water spirit mamiwata, encumbrance by social bonds defines what it means to be human, and as long as humans are living, it is our bodies that substantiate us. We are not only constrained by our own materiality, we analyze ourselves according to it. The substantiveness of humans poses limits, but ethereal agents are not so constrained. Their insubstantiality suggests that the possibilities for what people can imagine about them are greater. Moreover, the experience of diaspora for human beings is different from the travels of disembodied ethereal agents, not the least being the very real subjection to marginalization, disfranchisement, and trauma that mortals face, and that spirits may or may not, depending on how mortals envision it. My point is not that the flights of spirits and those of humans are commensurate, yet we can still find approaches from immaterial culture, ideas about invisible yet vividly imagined and vividly imagined and imaged spiritual forces, instructive for human diaspora studies. As Henry Drull nicely phrases it, mamiwata, quote, lives on the hyphen of existence, end quote. One could argue that scholars of New World diasporas, Stuart Hall for one, are also striving to get at these hyphens of diasporic existence with such approaches as hybridity, décollage, cross-cutting dialogue. But the challenge is not to equate hyphens with fragments. One way is to characterize fragments as ruptures and discontinuities, as in Hall's work, which asserts formative creative processes of diaspora, as a corrective to characterizations of diaspora's deformations. But metaphors operate within semantic contexts. Human bodies in diaspora are still corporeal, substantiated, and enclaved by the concept of culture and its itemizations, the search for identity and its healing properties, and the exclusivities of boundaries, whose consequence is an affirmation of race. I will end by noting a direction that diaspora studies might take, moving away from the constraints that I have argued it continues to recite, and building on discussions of diasporic spirits like mamiwata and the works noted earlier, listed really, where authors have tackled Afro-Indo or Afro-Asian synergies without the concept of diaspora serving as their main object of inquiry. One direction might be to approach diasporic peoples as being part of cultures rather than as possessors of cultures. And I know that's tricky, I'm just saying. Modes of belonging are vast and contextually driven. They are forms of agency and consciousness that accommodate or reject, but do so on the basis of attachments that are not necessarily based on claims of ownership, of culture, which typically includes some notion of exclusivity. Diasporic spirits flow through the air, water, and land, identified with particular traditions or complexes of traditions. When diasporic humans are not asked to represent a culture through phenotype and genealogy, or be the method of a culture's charting through selected representative cultural items, they will not as likely be prefigured actors in service of questions about diaspora whose answers may be irrelevant or misleading. Understood to be cultural beings, of course, but without this kind of cultural embodiment, diasporic humans can move through analytical space that is truly open-ended territory. In a similar vein, if identity is treated as a form of consciousness that remains living on the hyphen of existence, poised to be thought of as something else and not just emerging as such from this existence, a contingent and transitory one, then the restoration of selfhood need not be tied to being fulfilled by a cultural checklist, and by implication a racialized one. That, as Jemima Pierre, I don't have time to talk about her, very good book, but you should all read it, that as Jemima Pierre observes, misses or sidelines the structures of power in which culture is expressed. Borders and frontiers are messy, neighborhoods and communities are heterogeneous, alliances emerge from diversities that perceive a common stake. Spirits and their immaterial counterparts are not necessarily encased in or tracked by bodily armature and artifact, and the flights of spirits turn them into transcultural phenomena read through multiple cultural lenses. Our challenge is to explore the ways that diaspora, as theory and as lived experience, can reconcile the contradiction inherent in our approaches and think about ways to be able to see diasporic peoples between as well as within shifting historical, cultural, ideological, and perhaps spatial and temporal terrains. Thank you.
Everyone. Let's see if I can do this. I might need some assistance.
Here, why don't you talk and I'll, oh, but they can't hear you.
Yeah, no, they can't. Sorry. Is anybody in the room that can help me with this? Here, Brenda. I'm sure it's really simple and I'm just pushing it the wrong way. Thank you. I wasn't forceful enough. I'm so sorry. Hi, I'm Jill Lane, and I direct the Center for Latin American and Caribbean Studies here, and I have one of the daily pleasures in my life is having Aisha Khan as a colleague. We are both faculty at CLACS, and I'm thrilled to be able to moderate a discussion. I'll tell you how it will work. I will say a few things. I've just heard the talk for the first time myself, so do not expect a great profundity, but lots of enthusiasm and eager questions. And we will open the floor for your questions, and probably take a couple questions at a time, and then have Aisha comment on them.
Let me run and get my pen while you're talking, because I can't remember.
So I wanted to thank you so much for sharing this work with us. It's huge. You can tell this book, whenever it comes out, is going to be a big one. And And it seems an absolutely perfect talk for the aims of this series, such as I've understood them from our colleagues, which is to really think about the, well, at least one of whose aims seems to be to really think about the formative power of these concepts that shape imaginaries, right? And sort of what an imaginary is, but with the role here of ideas like culture and identity and diaspora, these key words, key concepts in our academic field, but then far beyond our academic field, how the academic field reproduces the world according to these very not only very complex terms, but terms that seem to both. I like so much how you captured the ways in which some of these terms are deployed in order to take us into new terrain, only to find out that they're also reinscribing a lot of the very things that they hoped to unsettle. And I think it's amazing to think about that. I'm just blown away by the idea of these ethereal diasporas, these diaspora of spirits, and it does seem like such an engaging way to step back and look at the to think of diaspora through a completely different set of terms, and yet ones that are very have always been at the heart of so much practice that gets called diasporic, right? So I wanted to just have you talk a little bit more. I was interested as a scholar of performance myself. I was interested in sort of those edges between the ethereal and the material. I'm totally compelled by the idea of a kind of immaterial diaspora, or a diaspora that resists easy codification or settling into objects and things that could be readily put into a ethnological museum or and named and categorized according to identity and culture. But I was also struck that obviously there's all sorts of material objects that allow a spirit like this one to, maybe not the only way the spirit makes herself known, but it's one of them, right? And I was particularly curious your thinking about where some of the, or if you've thought of it, where some of the embodied relationships with these spirits, I guess I would say, the places where there are dances that call forth a spirit, or so many of the really evocative practices that are about being, spirit possession or notions of spirit possession and so on. How do we think about the human body as the receiver of those things, and how you would map some of this thinking across this thinking in terms of what would the analytics of that kind of an object or practice look like from where you are now? I don't know. Does that question make sense?
Yeah, unfortunately, there are people sitting in this audience who are vastly more. Our very own CLACS people who are vastly more knowledgeable about spirit possession. I'm looking at you. Don't look back there. I'm looking at you, Catherine. I'm not an expert on spirit possession, but I do appreciate what you're saying, that these ethereal agents become embodied through the as we say, mounting, and there's all kinds of debates about whether the word possessed or possession should even be used. That's a debatable word now. But for lack of a better term, how they, let's say, enter the bodies of mortals through which they make themselves known, right? And so that, again, is a part of this. Would have to be would have to be factored into how do we understand diasporas then as more like what these spirits are able to do, even as they are embodied as mortals. What kinds of ways can we understand their travels, their adventures, if you will, their forms of agency, that because they would not be confined by the mortal body as the mortal person is, right? They transcend the body even as they're in it, right? And so I think that that would be a great place, spirit possession, again, for lack of a better term, would be a great place to start thinking about what the possibilities are of these beings to instruct us on thinking about diasporas that are not, again, objectified, itemized, because my argument is that none of these items can really escape their racialization, and ultimately they're all attached. And so why is it that the spirit can mount, as it's known, a human and not take on the associations of that human? That spirit has more power than the human. The human becomes the spirit, not the other way around.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that is a great place. If you're anybody who's an expert on spirit possession, take the mantle and run with it, because that's a great place to start. Yeah.
Great. Are there questions bubbling up, comments? Okay, you got a mic right there, just so that the video can hear you.
Doesn't one have to ground the transmission of these beliefs, these spirits, in expressive social interaction, and accepting that premise? Because I think otherwise you really you're super organic. If it's not transmitted and through expressive interaction. Thinking about expressive interaction, it's really a premise of creolization, that you have different cultures interacting and belief systems, whatever, and cultural processes, beliefs, practices, objects emerge from that interaction. And just kind of extending that a bit, on some of the other things we're speaking about. So the kind of the imaginary of Asia in the Caribbean is historically fixed, because, for example, you have Wahhabism in Trinidad through being brought from Saudi Arabia, whatever. You have ongoing relationships among Asians who are interested in promoting Indo-Caribbean culture in continuing interaction with Asia. And then you also have practices in Trinidad in particular, where you have increasing intermarriage among Indo-Caribbeans and Afro-Caribbeans. You have increasing frequency of Indo-Caribbeans engaged in carnival, tassidramic, featuring more. You have kind of soca. It slips my mind.
You mean chutney?
Yes, chutney soca, which is as a creolized form. So, what I'm trying to say is that can't one look at this as a phenomenon of expressive interaction with a more fluid and processual view of these cultural forms that have a empirical material reality?
Right, but then, oops, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I would say that Indo and Afro in the Caribbean have always gotten together and have formed kinship. I think the formality of marriage is more recent, perhaps, but I think that it's a myth of segregation that has all kinds of political layering to it, and also Indo-Caribbean, Indo-Trinidadians always participated in carnival, right? It's just, on, again, a more visible national culture level, this becomes more acknowledged post-independence, right? But I think that, the problem there would still be, and all of these things are true, that's what creolization is, right? Things happen, things change, things get reproduced, things get, new things become, right? Come into being. But then the question is, how are you going to talk about these? If you call these populations diasporic, if you cease to call them diasporic, you'll have other problems in the way you represent them and want to analyze their historical and political and cultural context. But if you want to think about them in terms of a diasporic framework, how are you then going to understand what makes them part of this Indian diaspora or this Chinese diaspora or this African diaspora? How can you talk about the cross-cutting dialogues? How can you talk about fluidity and hybridity, which you see in creolization. You can see it on the ground, and yet still have these ultimately segregationist, if you will, kinds of analytical lenses. So you can, sure, you can talk about Indo-Caribbean doing this and that, these folks do this and that, all you want to, but if you're talking about a diasporic community and in the same breath saying Indo-Caribbean, what makes them Indo-Caribbean, especially in face of all the creolization that you are correctly pointing out. We can't keep harking back, the problem is in a nutshell, what are our criteria? And and I'm arguing this is not simply an academic question, but it is a very deeply political question of what these criteria are that keep reinforcing the very thing that we are trying to argue against. Right? So I can't disagree with you that the Indo-Caribbean is about expressive interaction, and it has become what it is from 170 years of being in the region, in the Caribbean region anyway. But that's a process of creolization that may or may not be thought of in diasporic terms. Right? And it's when you think of it in diasporic terms that you have the problems that I'm referring to. And when you think of it as creolization in other ways, as I said, you get other kinds of arguments and problems. As you know very well, I'm sure, given your examples, largely around authenticity issues and, who's a Wahhabi and who isn't and when it got there. And that these are all debated within these communities, not just, observed to exist from the outside. So I think the problem is really the problem, the real villain here, if you will, is the concept of diaspora, right? Let's not put too fine a point on it.
I think you can wait for a mic to come.
Thank you for the talk. I'm curious about the interaction between the ethno-national diasporas that get in vogue, so like the Colombian diaspora or Dominican diaspora, and the broader formulation of diaspora that you put forth. And the reason why I'm interested in that interaction is because I'm seeing the U.S. State Department concretizing diasporas in a really problematic way, and I'm interested in looking at that. So we can talk about this at another point, but
we probably will.
We probably will, yeah. So how do you see the ethno-national diasporas and the broader diasporas that you mentioned interacting?
Well, and how do you mean concretizing them in what sense?
For example, like producing materials to encourage immigrants to remit to their home countries, invoking them as being part of like a specific hyphenated diaspora. So instead of acknowledging the heterogeneity of those communities and like the different availabilities to be able to remit in those ways, just kind of glossing all of that using the term diaspora
and encapsulating them for heuristic purposes.
Mm-hmm. And they're in ethno-nationalism, not acknowledging race either. So
well, again, then you could also argue, and all of these scholars would argue that ethno-nationalist sympathies fly in the face of trying to understand all of these as a kind of experience of fluid exchange, right? And that, in fact, but again, even Ang says, we have to use Asian diaspora as strategically essentializing to focus our analysis, bearing in mind all the while that there is no such thing as Asian, and as Palumbo Liu says, and in fact, Asian signals racial anyway, which he's critiquing. So yes, ethno-nationalists. What I would do, what you're going to have to do, Saudi Garcia, is what you're going to have to do. What you're going to have to do is think about in your case that you're looking at, and this is not just for Saudi, but in general, is when is that ethno-nationalist position and its variations, because it always comes in variations, important stakeholding and for whom. And that's the lived experience that I, as an anthropologist, would be really interested in. But in theoretical terms, it is always going to be something that contradicts the progressive correctives of contemporary diaspora studies. Because, and it goes back to a really interesting problematic. And even as I was reading this, I was thinking this and, stumbling a little bit here and there in my words because my brain is over here. The idea of, how do you, and even Michelle, I can't remember her, Mind Like a Steel Trap. I'll tell you the name in a minute. I'll think of it. Michelle Stevens at Rutgers has a really good article where she's taking from Stuart Hall, but because Stuart Hall, his article was, what is the popular and popular culture? I think that's his essay. And she takes that and says, what is the black and black diaspora? Right, and again, I didn't have a chance to talk about all these people that we don't have time for, but again, it goes back to that idea of how do you preserve a sense of social justice while at the same time not. Am I shouting? I'm getting all excited. While at the same time not falling back into those same limiting discourses of identity that that undermine the social justice, even as you are trying to highlight or throw a lens on an analytical eye, as Aang calls it, onto your subject, right? So how do you define your subject without entrapping your subject? I mean, that's how do you say hashtag Black Lives Matters? And no, it isn't simply that all lives matter, but at the same time, how do you say, well, in fact, we are part of a larger system of social injustice, right? Just to take it a little bit out of diaspora. So that's what I would say would be kind of the terrain that I would be thinking about with that problematic. The lived experience of the stakes of the different ethno-nationalist claims. Because as I said very briefly in the paper, let's not forget that Indo-Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean people have a big stake in their own authentic selves, right? And theorists can easily gloss over that, right? But in anthropology and ethnography, not that we're not theorists, but we have to listen to what people say. That's our bread and butter, right? So sometimes it's really hard to appreciate the grassroots contentions that again may go against the grain of our own political sympathies. Right? So I would say stakeholders and the nuances of those lived realities versus the conceptual symbolic violence that's done through these concepts that undermines what you're trying to hear from people. Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah.
Hi, thank you so much. There's an awful lot to get my head around, and I wish I could hear it all over again.
We can arrange that.
If you could just repeat it, then maybe I could formulate a question. But no, look. So I love this idea of ethereal diaspora. And I hope to cite you on that. So,
I wish you'd run with it. It will be great.
But that said, I'm really having trouble getting my mind around separating spirits from material and visual culture. And then it seems like a spirit is developed in the back and forth between this imagining and like this image, for example, that the image itself is the source of exegesis for someone who serves Mamiwata. And that seems to make the spirits, more than anything, totally able to be appropriated for national culture, right? For example, their songs, their dress, folklore dances.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly the religious imaginary is totally racialized. That Mamiwata, if you can even say that there is a Mamiwata, because as you pointed out, like she's different everywhere,
Mm-hmm.
right? How can you say that Lassie Ren uses this image as Mamiwata in Suriname, as Mamiwata in Ghana?
Or Durga,
Right.
she's
Right,
she's
yeah.
Hindu goddesses also.
Or like
Yeah.
Sandra Bonney makes the point so good.
Right, right.
At what point does this family resemblance get stretched so far that it's not actually livable?
Yeah.
Right. So, I guess the question is, given the intimacy with material culture for a spirit, and how a practitioner, I mean, to bring it back down to the ground, knows the spirit through what the spirit drinks, looks like in an image, as well as sort of charismatic experiences, you know, dreams, encounters with the spirit mounting a body. Given that sort of dialectic of immaterial and material, which also makes it, you know, something that can be appropriated by state powers and something that is racialized. You know, like, how does that get us beyond a lot of the trappings of diaspora?
Yeah, I mean, I would say that everything under the sun can be appropriated by forms of power, state power, and otherwise. Nothing is sacred in that. Oh, no pun intended. Nothing is. That was my second really good pun of the day. And you know, nothing is immune. Okay, so and therefore everything under the sun is, if it's subject to power and unequal relations of power, because that's what we mean by power, then anything can be racialized, anything can be gendered, anything that in the service, you know, all these concepts do ideological service for forms of, forms of power, right? And certain kinds of vested interests. So I'm not arguing that looking at questioning the corporeality of human diasporas as a kind of inescapable, chasing our tails around, correcting our ideas, and just a big tail chase. I'm not. I'm saying that not that is the anodyne to all our problems with our racializing and culturalizing, if you will, kinds of analyses. I'm not being very clear when thinking out loud. I'm not saying that anything is protected territory, right? What I'm saying is that that I think that spirits are absolutely, I mean, I would say that Mami Wada is not actually racialized specifically. She becomes whatever she is, whether she's a mermaid or whether she's a male or whether, she's the Sukuyan, the seductress, whatever she is, that and whatever kind of racializing or genderizing if that's a word that's going on, I think that's what happens. So I would say that number one, maybe the obvious point, that I think ethereal agents are more malleable and less subject to confinement than humans are, because humans are charted through their phenotype and the objects with which they are associated. And I think ethereal agents or spirits have a broader range of being disembodied or transcending those markers, those emblems, right? So that's not to say that they are never racialized. That's not to say that these experiences with spirits can never be co-opted. I mean, gosh, look at Papa Doc. These things happen. But I'm just saying that analytically, if we really want to not just talk, but walk the walk of hybridity and dialogue and understanding outside the box of race and outside the box of culture that signals race, that ethereal agents and their porosity, if you will, and their freedom from time and place, as I said, but without being free of history, may be one way to look. Spirit possession may be one way to look. So I really don't mean to give the impression that anything is not subject to the crush of power. Yeah.
Aisha, thank you.
Thank you for coming, my dear.
Yes, I
Oops,
wanna ask,
sorry, I shouldn't say my dear.
Yes, you can. You can say my dear all you want.
I want to ask a hard question.
I know, this is going to be so hard. Oh, my God.
Maybe some of it we'll talk about after. But you kind of basically prompted me by mentioning Black Lives Matter.
Okay.
Okay, so I'm trying to make this clear. So one, I want to ask you how you would connect this to trios, because I know it's connected to trios, idea of bidding, idea to culture. So how you would extend that. But I also want to ask you then if we don't need to be more forceful, maybe about rejecting racial language. Like, I think it's about politics, right? So you use the example, can we say Black Lives Matter without, like, we don't want to say all lives matter, but we do have to say Black Lives Matter. Like, why can't we push ourselves to not say Black Lives Matter? Say something like racial justice matters. And in a way, the question is then, how is it that Black nationalism might be still constraining so much of what we do within the academy? And when do we as intellectuals challenge Black nationalism? Right? Think about how Black diaspora thinking is an outgrowth of Black nationalism. So maybe how do we make a difficult political choice, knowing that Black is something being invoked and being, in some ways, we demanded to say Black. When do we then say we can challenge white supremacy without naming something Black?
Yeah, I think that's a fabulous question. Can I repeat that? Because I would like this to be a discussion. This is Harvey, who's fabulous and a genius, and I adore him. And I'm so glad you're here. The question that you're raising is, now I'm taking your moderator role. The question that you're raising,
You're doing great.
I was so busy praising you, I forgot your question. Basically, how do we challenge white supremacy without using the concept or term Black? I think that's everybody should write this down. That is a great question. I think, and okay, my short answer, because I really would like, if we had time for a conversation, this is supposed to be actually a conversation, that I would say that as long as one of those, of whatever it is more vulnerable, it has to be voiced in a way that draws attention to that vulnerability. So, Blackness vis-a-vis white supremacy, right? Not other things, but vis-a-vis white supremacy is vulnerable to white supremacy. Whites are vulnerable to white supremacy. I heard, and can I just have a little digression here? I heard, no offense, I hope I'm not offending anybody here, but I heard, yes, thank you. Who said that? Yes. Okay, do you want to say what he said?
That white people don't know what it's like to live in the ghetto.
Or be poor. He said white people don't know what it is to be poor. And this is when he and Hillary Clinton are in Flint, Michigan, and they're, going on, concerned about the water and all of that, environmental racism and all that stuff. I don't, that's not the term they used, I don't think. But in any case, so whites also are vulnerable to white supremacy. But I would say, as long as one of those factors, one of those identified entities is vulnerable to that supremacy, it has to speak in a way that asserts its own presence. So the question is, how do you assert your presence as vulnerable through your Blackness vis-a-vis white supremacy without pointing to your Blackness? So I would say that would, in that case, you have to. And Black can be, any kind of, like if we were in England, it would be African heritage and South Asian heritage people. So, but whatever that Blackness means, vis-a-vis whatever that white supremacy is. I don't know what do other people think?
So that is a very difficult question, and I'm kind of going through it with this crisis of imagination, imagining ourselves, in other words, as individuals of color. But I'm a Bahamian American, and I'm not African American, but I do feel some sort of solidarity with someone that would have complaints about white supremacy. And so I think there's a factor of prioritization that has to take place, especially within the political realm. And I don't know if it will be effective or productive to kind of create this. It seems like there would be an internal hierarchy that would start to form. I'm not African American, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, I'm this, and growing further away from this sort of one goal that needs to happen, which is this sort of identity of, liberation, as opposed to identity of Caribbean. Because as Bahamians, we don't identify as West Indian. So there is this sort of ostracization of people from the West Indies that exists in the Bahamas that wouldn't take place in the West Indies, and it doesn't. I think that the importance, at least in this sort of political climate, is to create solidarity. I'm not saying that this is not an important project to sort of maintain difference, but there are external political factors that kind of thwart that sort of priority, and it's just creating sort of a division that may have to take second seat to the primary one, which is to identify as a person of color.
What do you think, Harvey?
I know, I was just going to take the mic from you to say the same thing. No, to ask him.
I don't want to dominate the conversation at all. So I'll say the question is coming from, it's coming from, in a way, the trio reading, right? Because I thought that piece was really bold, where he was basically saying, give up culture, right? Anthropologists need to give up culture because now it's counterproductive. And so I read your piece at the end, especially you're saying give up diaspora. In some ways, it's give up this bounded way of thinking. And to me, Black does some of that work. But because it has a certain political urgency to it, I think it's hard for us to say, I'm going to give it up. But to some degree, I think academics have, we have a certain privilege to say that we could think about something, as you're saying, that might be becoming, right? We could think about the identity to come without maybe feeling beholden to the identity that exists. We aren't exactly running for elections. And so those of us, I think, especially if you have tenure, you have that space to do the bold thing, right? No, I mean, it is politics, right? So the politics exists not just in the outside world, but within the academy. So I might not tell a graduate student to do that. But those of us who have tenure, I think we are the ones who could give up certain terms and take that risk.
Mm.
Left you speechless.
Yeah. I think we have time for maybe one more, if there is. Oh, Danette?
So I wonder if another way of getting, not at Harvey's question, but sort of coming back to what you're pushing us to do in the provocation of ethereal agents. And I keep wrestling with who are the humans that can imagine ethereal agents, right? Mm-hmm. So I keep thinking, when we think of the material bodies that might deploy such spiritual practices, aren't they race, aren't they class? And what does that mean? So then this imagining of ethereal agents as another way of thinking diaspora, don't we sort of come back to think, don't particular bodies line up in terms of how we would then construct this diaspora?
So is your question, if I'm understanding correctly, another very smart question, and I think I can't answer this one, so I'm going to try to repeat your question really long and then we'll run out of time. So are you saying that because it is mortals that express these ethereal agents, that the ethereal agents are necessarily enraced or encultured or engendered by virtue of their linkage with this material body called a human being?
Right, or a crass way of saying it might be, in Caribbean or now you guys make me, I can't even say Black Atlantic cultures, but
Our work is done.
okay, so certain middle and upper middle class identities are so, to the extent that it believes in spirits, it would look like a kind of a religion that's understandable, a religion that's acceptable. And then I think it would be alternate bodies and alternate practices that would aspire to these ethereal agents. And so I just wonder if we're not locking ourselves back into looking at particular race and class bodies or race and working class bodies in terms of, or to the extent that there are middle class bodies that are inhabiting these ethereal agents, they might be as alternative forms of cultural practices, recognizing that they're stepping outside of their particular class privileges.
Right. Yeah, that's a really, really excellent point, that I'm not giving enough credence to the creativity of those mortals who then transform themselves, their own corporeality, through the kinds of imaginings they have of those spirits, correct? Yeah. Okay, well then blame all those diaspora scholars, people. Right? Let's have a letter write-in campaign, because you're exactly right.
I think the only thing I would add to what you have said is, this ethereal, what did you call them?
Ethereal agents.
The ethereal agents are very historical. So I would add that there's people and their histories, and that makes us even more concrete.
Right, that was exactly my point, and that absolutely, Pamela, and that concreteness is, we're mired in it, no pun intended, number 3 for the day, we're mired in it in a way that the less concrete ethereal beings are not. But I think it's really interesting to think about how they are a part of history they have histories without being confined by history, in a way that humans, at least in Atlantic diasporas, are not, are confined in ways that these other beings are not, even though they are certainly part of history. They have their own histories. Yeah. I mean, I think if I were going to pursue this, I mean, I wish this was had been, we'd able to have a workshop, right? Because to me, these are really fun and interesting questions. And if I were to pursue this, I would want to think more about especially what many of you have touched on, which is, what is the relationship between the mortal and the immortal, right? In terms of these kinds of imaginings of alternative ways of being, right? So that's a great place for, here I'll pass the baton, because I'm kind of done with this. So now it's your turn.
That seems like
on that
note, please join me in
thank you very much,
Aisha. And if you're willing to carry the conversation on just a little bit further out in the hallway,
sure.
Please join us outside.